Hello Fun Army, and welcome to a section I'm going to call Jane Austen Just Surprised Me. No, she did, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But yeah, this is just a check-in on my bookshelf TBR from the other week. I just let you know how I'm getting on. So, to the lady herself then. So this is the beast that I've been working on, the complete novels. As I think I mentioned, I had finished Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, and I then moved on to Mansfield Park, which I knew nothing about, which was great actually, I think, for an Austen novel, to know nothing about it, nothing of what to expect. And I kind of went in, mostly with my Pride and Prejudice goggles on, to be honest, and it threw me, which I think that is what made me feel so surprised when I got to the end of this book. And I don't want to give any spoilers in case anyone hasn't read it and does want to have the same kind of fresh surprise moment that I had, or maybe you won't fall into that trap. I think I'm so familiar with Pride and Prejudice and fairly familiar with Sense and Sensibility. I have also seen a couple of different versions of Emma as well, so I haven't finished reading Emma yet, but you know, I'm sort of fairly familiar with the tropes that go with those particular novels, shall we say. And I think the trap I fell into was, you know, you start reading this book, you get to know the characters, you're like, oh, this is really interesting, getting to know the characters, great. Then we did go through quite a stagnant period, I'd say probably, I don't know, about a third of the way in. Like, everything was very focused on, like, I don't think it was even a whole week. It was just a period of a few short days, which expanded over several chapters. And I guess it was Austen trying to lay the groundwork for a lot of stuff. Now I've got through it, but it was pretty slow going. And then things picked up again, and there was lots of movement and lots of things happening, and you're like, oh, this is exciting. But yeah, I kind of thought she was following one particular trope, similar to what happens with Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, where, you know, you meet the character, you don't really like them, they have a lot of faults and seemingly not a lot of positives, but then as time goes on, you grow to like them, things change, blah, blah, blah. And I thought that's what we were experiencing here. And because I had that train of thought in my mind, I was viewing everything from that context. So I did not see coming what happened. And I think if you've been thinking more about the Sense and Sensibility tropes, but even then you've got a character like Colonel Brandon, who just, from having been around long enough ultimately, and put in like juxtaposition to people like Wickham, who are considered more dastardly, then you sort of have this period of transition where someone completely changes their mind about someone. And that's what I thought we were getting, and that is not what happens. So I actually had like a total shock horror moment when you get to the crux of Mansfield Park. And I think as well, because everything's sort of like really quite pleasant and bobbing along, all I can say is it was scandalous. Like, it's probably as scandalous as it would have been at the time. I literally went like, which I never expected to do in an Austen novel. So I was really pleased actually. And I understand from sort of now having had a browse on the internet and looking at a few people's thoughts on the book that actually some people don't like Mansfield Park because not that much happens in the grand scheme of things. But I'm like, actually it does. There are those few little pockets where Austen decided to focus on like two big events, I would say, that kind of happen. So she spends a lot of time going into detail around every single character and their position in that event. And again, now that I know what happens, I can see that it was leading up to a certain thing. But yeah, so the other weird thing I thought though is that I had my big shock horror moment. Then you have like the aftermath of the shock horror moment, which is very short, and then you effectively get the final couple of chapters straight after that, which is like wrap up, this is where everyone ends. And you're like, oh okay then, sure. which I guess was her saying, that's not what it was about, you were supposed to go on this journey, but my mind was blown. I really enjoyed it and I would not be sorry to read it again, although I think it would be interesting to read it again now that I know what happens and to have a slightly different lens on it as we go through. So yeah, that was Mansfield Park. As I think I mentioned in my TBR, I'm now going to pause before starting Emma. I should probably say at this point, I think I've started Emma a good 4 or 5 times over the last few years, and mainly because I've just been like at my mum's house and there was a copy of it there and I picked it up, so I was only reading it for like a couple of days where I was picking it up just before going to bed kind of thing. Equally, it's my least favourite of the stories I know. I do, perhaps controversially, enjoy the Gwyneth Paltrow version of the film. Partly, I think, because actually I think the character quite suits her. And also you've got Ewan McGregor singing, which is always a joy. And I think it was a really interesting cast, so it kind of plods along quite nicely and it's a nice little pleasant film to watch. But overall, I do think the character of Emma is a bit of a dick, so we shall see if actually reading the whole book changes my mind on that. But yes, I thought I'd give myself a little bit of a break, and we're going to move on to The Starless Sea, which is, I think it's the direct follow-up novel after The Night Circus from Erin Morgenstern. And as I said before, I love The Night Circus. It was one of those, again, it sounded good from the synopsis but didn't really know what to expect, and I just couldn't put it down. And I have been reliably informed that this is going to be a similar thing, so let's read the synopsis again because it's just so good. Are you lost or are you exploring? When Zachary Rawlins stumbles across a mysterious library book containing details from his own life among its pages, it leads him on a quest unlike any other. Following the clues inside, he is guided to a masquerade party, a dangerous secret club, and finally to a labyrinth filled with stories hidden far beneath the surface of the earth. But when the labyrinth is threatened, Zachary must race through its twisting tunnels and crowded ballrooms, searching for the end of his story. I can't even. I went to bed a little bit later than normal last night and I was like, shall I start it? Because I'd finished Mansfield Park yesterday morning. And I was like, shall I start it? And I don't know. It's one of those where ideally I think would want a whole day just to power through it because I'm not sure I could put it down based on, you know, judging it by its cover. I am very sold and excited by this, but you know, I did also love Night Circus, so I'm trying not to get my expectations too high because that's how you get disappointed, but I'm feeling it's going to be good. And yeah, you know, tomorrow is a Monday and therefore a work day, and I'm like, oh, I don't like to be left in the middle of an exciting book when I can't then just crack on and see what happens. So yeah, I'll see how I go today. See how I go. But yes, so this is what's next up, and I'm very excited about that. So I will next check in when we're at the other end. Well, so this. I finished it about an hour ago, and I'm still like, words. I know when I described the Night Circus to you, I talked about it being like transporting, engaging, mesmerizing, magical, and this is the same. And I knew it was going to be awesome. You could tell from the synopsis. And in fairness, it's been a quick read, so I started on Sunday when I had like a big portion of time, and then I've been trying to read bits in the evening before I go to sleep, but naturally even though I'm so engaged, I have been falling asleep because, you know, tired, old. We are basically I can't even get my thoughts in order. So it's ultimately just like stories within stories within stories within stories, which is amazing. And what's really interesting, I discovered when I got to sort of like the thanks and stuff at the back, is actually, even though there's sort of not like a direct correlation, well there sort of is, but I'll explain that in a minute. In the back she thanks BioWare because she'd been playing Dragon Age Inquisition, which I love, one of my favourite games. And she said that was kind of what had given her the creative spark to start this book, and I'm like, that's amazing. And you can actually see its influence. So that's what I mean by like, it's not a directness, but you basically have a number of different characters who are obsessed with stories in their own kind of different way, which, being me, and that I'm obsessed with stories, I was just like, my life, my life, my life! And even better, two of the main characters are obsessed with stories and stories in relation to video games. I'm like, oh my god, this is just the best thing ever. So they talk about that thing, like, actually, if you've ever seen the film Big, that's one of the earliest mentions of it that I remember, about having a story that you could then choose different paths to end. You didn't have to have the same ending, you can go off in different directions. And I think that's one of those things that I really love about the types of video games that I play, and I think that's obviously where she's coming from with her Dragon Age Inquisition hat on. Every choice you make takes you somewhere different, and she's effectively tried to create a book experience that explains that, and it's just so meta. Because it's literally like story within story within story. And this is one of the things they're discussing, is like, you know, what if you could choose all these different directions, how that relates to life versus stories, and is anything really predetermined? So there's a lot of like intense philosophical conversation that could come out of this, but at the same time it's just an incredibly woven story. And like, I was hooked to the end. I'm like, I don't know where this is going, I don't know where this is going. And you know when you get to that bit where you've got like this much still to go, and you're like, but you haven't answered my questions, I can't see where this is going, what's gonna happen, am I gonna be disappointed? I was not disappointed. I would have liked a bit of follow-on with some of the characters, but again, meta moment, she specifically explains within the narrative of the characters that ending a story where you can see an onward life for your characters and you get to imagine what that is one of the things that character likes about stories. And then guess what? That's what she did. So we did actually get enough of an ending that I was happy with the ending, but still I was like, oh. And because this is only her second novel, I don't know if she's ever likely to pick up those stories again, or whether that's just it now. That's just it. I just have to live with it. Maybe she'll make a video game. But I definitely, interestingly, it was a very similar experience to reading The Night Circus, but with a completely different premise, which is amazing, really. And I need to check actually when the Night Circus was published, because yeah, it's been a little bit of a gap between the two. And you could quite see why, if she's going to continue to just thread these amazingly complex narratives where she never really like, she'll answer some of your questions but she won't answer them all, and the rest is just kind of left to you to figure out, to either decipher and take your own meaning, or just decide that you're gonna let it go. Yeah, so I don't know how I could describe the plot to you in any way that doesn't give stuff away or just sound really confusing. Our central character is called Zachary Rawlins, and he is at university, and he's actually studying a master's, having already done a first degree, and he's probably pondering doing a PhD as well. And he's focusing specifically on stories, but stories within that video game space. So I think all of his degrees have been video game focused, and actually one of his things he does to de-stress is actually go to the library to read physical books. and he likes that sort of juxtaposition between, you know, this is me and I'm gaming and I love the stories within gaming, but also I actually just love to lose myself in books, which I can totally relate. And ultimately, he just starts to get pulled into his stories. I'm not going to say any more than that because there's A, I would go into spoilers, and B, it's intensely complex. But it is, I think, anyone who loves stories and loves video games would love this book. Because it's kind of like those things that you've thought a little bit about, not to this level of detail, but things you might have thought a little bit about, like, oh, you know, what if my life was more like the stories? And, well, be careful what you wish for. Oh my god. Yeah, that's probably all I can say about the plot, to be honest, other than to say, just read it. Just read it. If you love stories, if you love things that are fantastical and a bit magical, if you like video games, if you like story choices, if you like random interspersions of cats, this is the book for you. So yeah, it's amazing. 10 out of 10. I don't really know how I'm going to follow this now. Like, I have just been sat here being like, what do I do now? I am fortunately leaving the house in an hour, but thank God, otherwise I might just sit here all day and be like, what do I do now? In theory, my plan was this was one of the interspersions between the Austen novels, so I should now be going back to Emma. But bearing in mind I was already a bit dubious about whether I was going to enjoy Emma or not, coming down from that, I'm like, it's probably going to feel quite dry and dull and slow, and that's not very fair to Austen's writing. But yeah, when you are sort of coming from a completely opposite end of the scale kind of narrative, yeah, it could potentially feel like that. But we shall see. And anyway, as I say, I'm going out, I'm going to distract myself with other things, so maybe I'll be in a better mind space to approach Emma. Because then, so we've got Emma and Northanger Abbey. Is there another one? I'm gonna check. I'm not sure. But yes, then as you saw from the TBR, plenty of books still to go. I'm literally like, what will I do? What will I do next? I'm quite tempted to do the Thursday Next books actually, because there's 3 of them, and they should be quite quick. It's awful really, because I'm mostly just thinking about like how much space can I free up by finding books I don't like, which is awful. Like, I want to find books that I like. I want to read books that I'm going to enjoy. But ultimately I do need to free up the space. So I've, as I said, I've got to chop on and figure this out. So yeah, maybe Austen next, Emma, and then maybe the Thursday Nexts. We'll see. I'll keep you posted. Okay, so I finally finished Emma. Took a long time. Like, it wasn't one of those where you could just pick it up, read a couple of chapters and put it down before bed. It started off well and it ended really well. Everything in the middle was quite slow. I mean, I guess this one was designed to be a bit more of a commentary around day-to-day conversations, because there was just a lot of conversations about nothing that just went on for pages, and I really struggled. Like, I had to do a big, like, right, I'm gonna sit down for 2 hours and just read. And I did end up skipping some pages, which is not something I would normally do, but I'm like, am I learning anything? Is this moving the narrative forward? No. So yeah, I have to say, my least favourite Jane Austen thus far. Sorry. But the good news is that means we can move on to something else. So I decided to go with the first of the 3 remaining Jasper Ffordes we've got. This one, I think, is number 5. Number 5? Please hold, please hold. Where's the bit where it tells you? Yes, so I think number 5. So it actually looks like we've jumped quite a bit in the chronology since we last saw Thursday Next, our protagonist. Doesn't say much in the summary, to be honest. Literary detective Thursday Next is officially off the case. Once a key figure in the Bookworld police force, she is concentrating on her duties as a wife and mother, or so her husband thinks. You can tell this is written by a man. Unofficially, Thursday is working as hard as ever, and in this world of dangerously short attention spans, there is no rest for the literate. Can Thursday stop Pride and Prejudice being turned into a vote-em-off reality book? Okay, this could be good. Who killed Sherlock Holmes? And will Thursday get her teenage son out of bed in time for him to save the world? Okay, so I think it's going to be cute and easy, basically, which is exactly what I need after the trawl through Emma that we've just had. So will I'm trying to decide, will I zip through this and then jump on to the next Jane Austen? Because I think we've only got 2 to go now, so I think Northanger Abbey is next, and then the final one is Persuasion. And I know nothing about either of those, so yeah, so maybe if I zip through this one, then do Northanger Abbey, then I do the next one of these and sort of do it that way. Unless, of course, something else comes in to pique my interest, shall we say. I made the rookie error of watching the Shadow and Bone series on Netflix recently, and I'm like, oh my god, I need to read these books. I haven't bought them, I haven't, but I might. We shall see. I'm able to hold up at the moment, and I'm actually gonna see my mum in a couple of weeks as things start to open up again, so that book series that she bought me for Christmas will be in my hands, so we'll be adding to the shelf already. So yeah, I might be able to hold out. Maybe. We shall see. Anyway, so that's the update for now. I'll check back in with you later. Okay, so I've just finished this one. And it was actually really good. I'd forgotten how good they were. I think they left it on a slight cliffhanger as well, so I could almost sort of go straight on to the next one, which is obviously already on the shelf. But I think this is the thing, you have to be in the mood for them, because it's so cleverly written and it's so meta. You're literally just dealing with like, okay, this is the normal world and we call this Outland, and then you've got like the literary detectives, but then there's book world, and then there's jurisdiction within the book world. And then you've got all of these chaotic things happen in the book world, where evil genii are trying to change plots in books. And there are so many jokes, even now in this one, which, as I say, I think is the 5th in the series, where an evil genius has gotten away with one of these things they've tried to change within the book world. And it's actually how we know that book in the real world. So the funny thing about this one was there was a moment where there was an incident with pianos. There are only 15 pianos in the whole of book world. They just circulate them throughout the whole of, the world's books as and when they're needed. And there was this joke about someone meddling with the pianos and having dropped one right into the middle of Jane Austen's novel Emma, which, as you know, I just read, and it was a joke about the plot point that is already there in the book that we know in the real world, but it formed like an interesting comedic mini sketch in the middle of this book. So really enjoyed it, but now we're on to the next thing, and I should strictly be going back to Austen if we are playing by the rules, but this week I am not playing by the rules because, as threatened, I went to visit my mum and my Christmas present was there. So this is the Darkest Minds quadrilogy. Oh, it's a beast. I'm very excited about this though. It's still in the plastic packaging. I haven't dared to take it out until it was time. So I will be starting on the first one today, which is called The Darkest Minds. To be honest, I actually don't know that much about the details of the series, and let me put this, is so heavy. Let me put that down. Yeah, I don't know much about the series itself, other than the fact that I'd seen the film related to the first book. it does seem to sort of run along the same kind of lines as Hunger Games and the Divergent trilogy. So certain types of people are separated, but if I remember correctly from the film of the first book, I think actually it's something to do with the children being separated, and they are told one story for why they're being separated, but actually the real reason is very different, I think. It's been a little while since I watched the film, but at that point these books went on my list, and yes, my mum decided to get them for me for Christmas, and that was 6 months ago. So good times. So yes, nice to have caught up with my mum, I have to say. But yes, so yeah, exciting reading to come. I'll see how I go. If I suspect the way this will go, I will get really into it and I will need to read all 4. And then I'll go back to Austen, and then I can intersperse that with the other 2 remaining Thursday Next novels. But we'll see. You know, maybe I will fancy a break in between, in which case I'll bounce back to Austen. But it's that thing of Austen is good but slow. Even in Pride and Prejudice, which I love, it's still not a speedy read, especially if you're sort of doing that pre-bed read where you might be a bit tired. So it's nice to have some speedier novels for a while. I've got a couple of days off work, so I can just have some nice chilled reading time. So yes, I will report back when we're done. Okay, I'm back, and this beast is done. Interesting times. I really was excited about the no. I was excited about the premise, and I still enjoyed the premise. I struggled a little bit with the execution, to be honest. So overall, you effectively have, like, the first 3 books are a I'm going to move them before I knock them off. The first 3 books are a contained trilogy, and then the 4th book is sort of 5 years on. And weirdly, it feels like she's starting a new trilogy, but she didn't. She stopped after that book. I was like, oh, okay. So you're not exactly left on a cliffhanger, but there are a lot of unanswered questions, which was weird. So if we talk about the main trilogy for the moment, the overall premise is, as I'd said previously, that suddenly, out of nowhere, children start dying, like literally just dropping down dead, and nobody really knows what's wrong with them. And like in massive numbers, to the point where, you know, some kids are still turning up to school and like half of their classmates are gone. So it's really like quite a huge thing. Nobody knows what's going on. And then there are these groups of children who don't get sick and don't die. So they start getting sent off to these, I just also try not to say things that give away what happens, but to these medical centres to be monitored and tested to see why it is that they don't get sick versus why everyone else does get sick. And actually what also then happens is that you start to see those children manifesting certain abilities. But the doctors and the government are pronouncing that those abilities are an illness and something that they're looking to cure. So they effectively keep the children in these facilities, and that's sort of the story that they've given to the world, that they're just focusing on keeping an eye on these kids and just making sure that they're not going to get sick later on, and trying to find out what it is about them that means that they didn't get sick, and blah, blah, blah. So there's a whole lot of, let's say, cover story, and I don't really want to go into all the stuff that you find out, because I don't want to ruin that for you if you do want to read it. So in the trilogy we are following the main character Ruby, who is one of these children who's actually manifested some quite strong abilities. So she'd actually witnessed some other kids dying and getting sick, so she's quite traumatized already. And then basically one day her parents don't recognize her anymore, and then she gets taken into one of these centers. So you sort of see her journey through that, the people she encounters, and what happens to her next, which is all pretty cool, to be honest. Like, the whole trilogy spans her journey basically, and you pick up a core group of people through that journey. So there's sort of 4 of them initially, and then you do pick up a couple of other sort of periphery people in that core group as well later on. There are some emotional ups and downs. There are some people that you meet that you also lose. There are some people that you don't know if you can trust, and there's lots of intrigue, and there are lots of surprises. But ultimately, I did kind of feel, and it may just be I'm used to a different kind of pace, it was almost like those 3 books could have been 1 or 2. Like, I found it very sort of, you know, each chapter spans maybe like a half an hour period. It doesn't move particularly quickly. So I found it quite difficult to just be sort of stuck in the same place for a long time. But as I say, I really enjoyed the premise, and I liked where you got to overall. So then when I had this 4th book, and I'm like, okay, so what happens in this 4th book? And as I say, you're 5 years later on, and then you're suddenly also following a different main character. So the girl's name is Zhu, and she was actually part of the core group from the trilogy. So you're like, oh, that's cool. It's actually quite hard to talk about this without giving away what happens. Yeah, I found Zhu an interesting character in the main trilogy, so it was cool to be following her all of a sudden. But actually, I kind of found that I guess the inner monologue that you get from both Zhu and Ruby being the central character in their individual books, because the writer writes in the same way, I found, you know, I knew my picture of Zhu from that first trilogy was quite different to then the inner monologue version of Zhu you get in that 4th book. And I found that quite off-putting, because I sort of actually found she made her quite similar to Ruby in certain ways. And I don't know, maybe it's just been a while since I've had the teen angst that they both experienced, but I couldn't really get along with it, I have to say. And again, like, really interesting premise for this book, but it was quite difficult to get through because it was that same slow pace, and I'm like, well, okay. And then there were these little plot points where it's like, oh, didn't see that coming, or oh, where is this going? And then suddenly you get to the end of the book, and then there's no more. So I'm like, okay, what happens in the rest? Like, what happens in the rest of the world? I just feel a little bit left hanging, even though I sort of could have probably skipped through a lot of the pages. I do kind of want to know where that went, but she doesn't seem to have anything more to say on it at the moment. She has said she would write other books if other stories came up, but I'm like, but you haven't finished this story. So yeah, I did also read whilst I was doing that research that she's written some other novellas, but they fit in between the trilogy books, I think. So yeah, overall not bad. But I have to say this one is going in the charity bag. So in terms of like the bookshelf situation, this is good news, because they're not going on the shelf, they're going in the charity bag. So that puts me back now to Jane Austen. So I think Northanger Abbey is next in the order. And then I will probably intersperse that with the next Thursday next, and then back to do Persuasion, which I think is the final Austen. Then the final Thursday next, and then we're on to a whole new category of ness from the bookshelf. So I'm actually going to wrap this summary here, and then obviously I'll keep you posted in a future video on how that TBR is going, because it is lengthy. But I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've got any recommendations on similar books based on what you've seen me read, then I would also love to hear those. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!